I don't think Nate is coming. So,
What Nate?
all right. So we are finishing off the rest of chapter 5. I hope that I stopped this in the right section. We'll find out here in a second if I did. Um, so I mentioned kind of right at the start how I really see these stories as kind of the first one is sort of like the ultimate uh kind of like deliverance from demonic forces passage, and then the second one is kind of like the ultimate uh healing passage, although there'll be more of those that come up, but I do kind of feel like these are sort of um um in like the Christian mindset of whenever we think about these are kind of like highlight stories. um I'm also uh kind of glad. I know last week I had said that I really wanted to make sure, or I really wanted to try and get both of halves in last week. But I'm actually glad that we kind of didn't, because I was able to really think about a lot of this stuff. Um, and so I think I have a lot more um, to discuss than I would have if we had talked about this last week. So we'll see how that goes when we get to it. We're gonna listen to the whole thing again, because I really do think that it's really common for people to break these stories apart, but I really do think that these stories are they're they're so intertwined and they are meant to go together.
So we're just gonna listen to all 43 verses of them?
It's like 20 verses.
No, I mean the whole chapter.
No, it shouldn't be the whole chapter. I tried to stop it right at the beginning.
Oh, I thought you said you wanted to. You just said you wanted to do.
What I meant by do them together is I meant do both, because it's Jairus's daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. I want to listen to both of those at the same time.
At the headers that obviously weren't there when it was written.
Yes.
We were going to pretend like it mattered more than make sure.
Yes.
Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue.
So we just missed the first verse.
No.
And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him. So we were on the outside and we're coming back to the inside, to the heart of where Jesus' ministry had been taking place.
Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat.
Okay. So just kind of want to highlight that ending verse at the end of he is again, right, telling her, don't tell anybody about this, even though he just kind of had a public healing with the woman with the issue of blood. And then just further out in the last story, had this whole thing with the demoniac where he instructed him to go out and tell people. And it seems to be this differentiation between like where he is. But so we're actually gonna start with even though the story kind of starts with Jairus, we have him as like the ruler of the synagogue, and so that kind of gets repeated, so we know that he's a really important person. Also, we had seen earlier in Mark that the synagogue leaders have had an issue with Jesus, right? It's an oppositional kind of force to him. But and also, I guess I also kind of want to highlight the part about where he is asking he's asking Jesus to come and help his daughter. I've seen in some commentaries people make a comparison between this and whenever the centurion shows up to Jesus and asks the centurion for a similar thing to heal his servant. And right, he says, you don't even need to come. You can just do it from afar. And so because of that, some of the commentaries are like criticizing Jairus's like lack of faith. And I don't think that's really like in view in Mark. First of all, the centurion story is not in Mark, if I remember correctly. I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure it's late. I'm pretty sure it's in like Matthew. I'm pretty sure it's in the other gospels. We can look that up.
We need to.
We can look that up.
Only when we get to it.
You can look it up. You got a phone.
Might be 13 weeks.
Maybe.
Oh, we know.
Maybe it could be well.
Yeah. It'll be nice.
But it seems like I don't think that that's necessarily the lack of Jairus's faith. Because like obviously he has a measure of faith to even like come up and ask Jesus this thing. But the woman with an issue of blood. So pretty much everyone agrees that this is probably some kind of issue with like menstruation. It's probably something like that's what's going on. That's wrong, right? And it's very common that people will point out that if that is what she was having trouble with, then really she shouldn't have like even been in the crowd, right? Because under Jewish law, she is unclean. Actually, when we get to the bottom, I have like a list of like a bunch of like comparisons and contrasts between the two women. And then actually the one commentary that I always talk crap about, he actually has a pretty good contrasting list between the woman and Jairus himself. And so I want to go through that too at the kind of towards the end. But one of the things that I want to point out with that, well, I guess maybe there's so in the one story, it's obvious that there's a connection to menstruation. In the other one, in the case of the dying girl, it's not as obvious, but there might be a connection in the fact that it points out that she's 12 years old, which is roughly around the age of when puberty starts. And so maybe there's a connection there. But probably the more connection is that connection of she's 12 years old, the woman's had this problem for 12 years. And you're going to see, and there's a bunch of these like things that kind of link these two different women. Part of the reason why I'm so glad that actually we waited till this week is because last week was going to be just me kind of pointing all of this out. And I didn't really have a plausible theory for why I think all of these connections are being made. I certainly looked for it. I don't think people, I haven't seen anyone give a great answer for why these stories are linked. I have one. I have a speculation. So again, when we get to it, if everybody's like, that's stupid, that's not it, you can ignore it. But I'm kind of convinced that that's probably what it is. There are differences in contrast in the two stories, but it seems that they are there. Okay, so one of the other things is that the differences in contrast in the two stories are probably there so that we can realize that the difference is not instrumental to the healing. It's probably to show that healing can happen in a multitude of ways. There's not like one set like list of things that you have to, or like checklist of things that you have to meet in order for the healing to occur. Like it's very fluid and things can be different, but God will still heal. There's also a big question about like why is this story so much about women? Mike Winger talks about this in his video. He agrees with some other scholars that it might just be to kind of elevate the position of women, since the position of women in that society wasn't that great. So he's doing this to kind of like uplift them. Personally, like
Panning? Is that just panic?
pandering.
My bad, that's the one.
Yeah, like he's and I sort of disagree with that for that exact reason. I really don't think that Jesus is just pandering to women here. Like that's not really a thing
Mostly
that he does.
Doesn't that also feel like more of some modern angle anyway?
It does feel like a modern angle. I think that there is a point to them being women, and we'll get to that whenever we get to.
But at the same point, like you can pander and still be genuine about it.
Yes,
which is what you're kind of supposed to do with the follow Christ. So, yeah.
right. And so,
say that,
it's very rare that the Bible is just like, "Yay, we're pro this," like we're pro women, or we're pro like some other thing, like it's almost never like that.
I would say, if anything, it doesn't feel to me like there were two stories about women thrown in here to meet a quota. We need to hit a certain number.
There's
of
no
women
diversity
stories.
quota in like the Bible, right? And also there's pretty much always the case that the way that the Bible handles things is anytime that the Bible is like, hey, we're pro this thing, there's also a bunch of stuff that's an example of like that thing being wrong or bad or like whatever, right? So it's like, hey, we're pro, right? You were like pro Israel, but then there's entire chapters, a whole history about how Israel is terrible and awful, and it's like, hey, I'm pro David. Yeah, David's a great, but like whole things about how he's bad, right?
Israel's never really been tried.
It wasn't though. Maybe under David.
Right. And so it's like to just have this like simple thing of like, and even with like slavery of just being like, oh, the Bible is like against this or whatever, but it's like it's almost always a like the Bible is very balanced about how it handles things and how it treats things. Okay. So by law, she should have been telling people. Instead, she snuck up on Jesus. She snuck up on God. Mike Winger had this idea that maybe she sneaks up because she thought that he wouldn't stop for her. I don't think that's the case. I think it's obvious that she sneaks up on him because she knows she isn't supposed to be there. I think that she knows that she's doing something that like she's not supposed to do.
She knows Peter Wolf's little hands.
Right.
Gotta watch those ears.
So this portion, touching of the garments. I've mentioned this before. Maybe I haven't done like a great job of explaining like the whole like symbolism involved with garments. But obviously like that starts with the Adam and Eve story. And then to cover up their sin, they're given these garments, right? They're given this garment of skin. And kind of the idea that gets played with the garments of skin is that they are a tool. And because they are a tool, they can get used for good, and they can get used for bad, or for either way, right? For good or for evil. And so there's a lot of stories about kind of various garments of skin, and so there's a connection between garments of skin, power, technology, and order, right? And so all these things, so like, right, because we talk about like the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel is like a permanent, like, because you wear garments of skin to protect you from the elements and from the outside world, or from other people, right? But you build a wall and a tower and structures for the same reason. They protect you from the elements, they protect you from, and so all of these things and all of these ideas are connected together. And part of the thing that's going on in the story, that's the through line throughout the Old Testament, and definitely in through the New Testament into Revelation, with Jerusalem being a new city, where you have cities in the Old Testament starting out as evil, like centers of like evil. In the end, there's a holy city, right? And so there's a way in which all of these like tools can be redeemed. And so we're kind of seeing that happen right here with the touching of garments and the way that garments are used in both of these stories. And whenever I say both of these stories, in this case, I'm meaning the woman with the issue of blood and the demoniac, because we didn't talk about that last week. But the demoniac has this element too, where he starts off naked and he's wild and crazy, but then he gets delivered and he's clothed, and he gets put in it, and it's clothed and put in his right mind. And so those two things are like the same, like being put in his right mind and being clothed properly. Those things go together. You can look in the rest of the Bible wherever it talks about being clothing properly and how that's related to being like in right standing and in right order, right? There's the story about Jesus, or like if there's a wedding and he invites people in and one of them isn't clothed properly, and they're like, we're going to send you out to where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so there's this idea of like, if you're not clothed properly, like you're doing something wrong, like it's out of order, and you're going to get cast to the outside. Okay. In this story, so part of what, and so if you like watch Jonathan Pageau's videos, he'll talk about this a lot, and it's really, it's sometimes hard to understand. But one of the functions of garments of skin and of technology in general is that it increases your body. Okay, it makes you larger, and so, I mean, in one way, like with just clothes or whatever, like there's more to you, there's more on you, whatever. But also, if you think of like technology of like your image or like your social media, right? Like you can be bigger, you can have a higher reach because you're like, especially like a famous person, right? Their picture is on there. They get seen all over the world. And so they are bigger, they are more widely known. And so like, in a sense, their body or who they are is bigger than other people, right? And obviously this had a much more like immediate thing in the ancient world, because a lot of times what would they do if someone, like, who were the famous people? Well, it was like the rulers. And what did they do? They get giant statues made of themselves, and those get sent around everywhere, right? And so in a sense, like, all of these different tools are being used to amplify people and make them bigger. In this story, Jesus's garment is making him bigger, right? It makes him bigger. It lets him extend outward more so that the woman can touch him. And it's through that power is transferred, right? So there's a lot of discussion that goes about how, like, what does it mean that power flowed out of him? What does it mean that power transferred out of him? In my opinion, you don't get a lot of great answers to this. Some people are like, is it like Jesus didn't have a choice and, like, she, like, zapped the power out of him and he, like, got, like, exhausted? Or was it he just, like, felt like the divine power flowing? I kind of think it's more of that. But also you can get into situations where people start to think, or I think people can fall into, like, a trap of thinking that they can kind of, like, strong arm God, right? Like, if I have enough faith, if I can get close enough to him and then I can touch him, well, it kind of doesn't matter what God wants. I'm going to, like, absorb the power out of him and can, like, be healed.
This holy grail theology.
Right. Which is really goofy and not really how it works. It really seems to me that the point of how the power flows out of him is not by virtue of her will versus, like, Jesus's will, but it's rather about Jesus's station. Jesus has such a high station. And also, I think, but although I don't think it's as clear in the text, but that he has the character where he's allowing the power to flow out of him. I don't think that she could just strongman him, right? And so that power flows out. And it's more, and so again, just, it's more about his station than it is about her will. Okay. Okay. So this gets to my personal theory for what I think is going on here.
When you say the what you're getting into, you mean like the connection between the stories, or why certain?
We'll hit it.
So before that, just while you're explaining, the station versus the strongman, it just kind of occurred to me, like, okay, did Jesus, because he's got this all-knowing side of him,
right
before the woman touches him, is he like, oh, she's gonna do it, like, or is he, like, unaware?
Okay, so actually we're gonna get to, like, exactly this point.
Because then I was thinking, like, okay, maybe right when you were explaining your theory, I was like, well, maybe it's like God the Father is seeing what's happening, and he's like, I'm rewarding you, woman, and my power will flow through.
Okay, so let me just, like, I'll teaser my theory right here, and we'll see if you guys can catch it. In my opinion, this story is mimicking another story that already happened, right?
In Mark?
No, earlier in
this. Okay, I might be spoiling it, but it feels a lot. There's some, like, Genesis.
Yes.
Adam and Eve.
Yes, that's exactly where I'm going with it. Okay, so, and it's really clear. It's really clear, in my opinion, at exactly that point in really two cases. So Jesus, perceiving in himself the power had gone off from him, immediately turned to the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" The follow-up sentence, and the disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" The whole point of that sentence is to point out the fact that Jesus's previous question was really weird and kind of silly. Now, they think that it is weird and silly because of one reason,
Right.
but there's a completely other reason why it's weird and silly. The completely other true reason why it's weird and silly is because he's God, right? So it's that same who is Jesus thing here where it's playing with it. where they're like, it's silly because everybody's touching you. No, it's actually silly because he's God and he already knew that, right? And the same, like the earliest instance where we have another part where God asks a very silly question that he already knows the answer to is in the Genesis story with the fall of Adam and Eve, where he asks, "Where are you?" So it's actually a very similar kind of question. Who touched my garments? He's asking about like the identity of this person, like where are you at? Same thing here, like who touched me? Like where are you at in this crowd? Right? Very similar question. And the response is, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Okay. So that to me was the thing that really like clinched it. And that what I think is going on here is that this whole story, both story with the woman, helped out by the story of the daughter, is that it is a reversal of Eve's story. Very specifically Eve's story, which is why there's two women that are like the main characters in this thing. And I was thinking about it because whenever I saw those connections, I was like, okay, that's definitely what's going on here. But it also explains, in my opinion, why we have this weird connection that's going on with menstruation. So I was like, why do we have this weird connection that's going on with menstruation? Well, what's the fault? What's the part of the curse of Eve's story? Well, the part of Eve's story is she gets cursed with pain and childbirth. So what does Eve do? Okay, so I like wrote this out. Eve grasps for something that she knows she's not supposed to take. Right? Eve knows she's not supposed to take this thing. She reaches out, she grasps it for it, and she gains power from it. She gains the power of good, knowledge of good and evil. Right? And then the response for doing that is God calls out, "Where are you?" And mankind, both her and Adam, respond with blame. They blame everybody else. Eve is then cursed with pain and childbirth. For this woman, she is only cursed, right? She doesn't even get like the redeeming aspect of childbirth where like she might get an actual kid, right? She probably didn't have an actual kid, couldn't have an actual kid because she's just full curse, right? So because of that, she is representative of the thing that like all of mankind is having, the problem that all of mankind is having, where we've had this continual gradual like loading up of sin that like the earth has been experiencing, right? And so she is a microcosm of that and just full curse. Okay. She reaches out for something that she knows she's not supposed to take, but it's still towards God, right? So you still have this level of like ambiguity in the tool, ambiguity in the action, but she's doing it towards God. She receives power from it. Then God asks the same question, "Where are you?" But she responds properly. And she responds properly not by blaming the rest of the world, blaming everything else. She goes, no, it was me. I did something that like I shouldn't do. I came up here and this is what happened. She takes the full responsibility, and that action, right? That faith redeems it, and like she's now healed. So basically, that was my like pet theory for what I think is going on here, and for what I think is the thing that like kind of ties these back together. And so there we have that. I don't have it tying as well to the little girl, but like I said,
But the little girl ties, at least with this one, a little.
she does. Oh, she ties a bunch, and
So
we're
it's
going to
like
get to that later.
A link in the link, you know.
Yes.
Well, and also the interaction of God asking, "Where are you?" and a person's response has been like more of a motif than just like a one-time incident.
Oh, yeah, it happened a bunch.
A number of times.
Yeah.
And this really is like there are a number of times where it is kind of like reversed on the on man's side, but this is like the more I'm looking at it, this is actually the best instance of like this is what should have happened at the beginning.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
to come in with an understanding of I did something wrong, but I'm going to tell you the full truth anyway.
Right. And I also think it was interesting because I was like, I don't think we ever really think about the need for, and I'm not saying, and I don't want to like, I don't want to elevate this woman above like what she actually is and what
Right.
she's serving in the story. Because I don't want to say that like, oh, she is redeeming like all women or something like that.
You don't want to be a Catholic about it.
Yeah, well, because Catholics actually make a similar problem with like Mary, right? Because like they elevate Mary too high and are like, oh, Mary is like the second Eve, the way that Jesus is like the second Adam. And it's like, okay, no, Jesus being the second Adam is like pretty well established, right? But also like all of that baggage is kind of thought of to be like subsumed by Adam, right? So like ultimately Adam is the one that's with the problem, and so ultimately Jesus is able to solve both the issues of Adam and Eve, right? He kind of solves both of them, and I'm not trying to go against that at all, but I'm trying to say that this is a picture of how Jesus, in that he's solving it for Adam and both Adam and Eve, but this is how it practically plays out, and it shows a way in which Jesus can provide that redemption for Eve's story in like women that are in a similar situation to what like I was gonna say, because I'm trying to like invoke like the human condition, right? Because like Jesus, like the whole thing that Jesus is doing is empathizing with like the human condition, and so this is a way for like the story of Jesus to impact like the woman condition, the female. I don't know how to like.
Well,
I don't know how to like
no,
word that
there is
better.
There is something to that, especially with Adam being just meaning man, but you can take that to encompass everything. You
Right.
can more look at
Right, because
Jesus' actions on the cross are redeeming Adam, but is redeeming everyone.
Yes.
But this seems like this story is almost speaking to a more like specifically redeeming the feminine in that saying,
Yes.
okay, really, I think it's just asking for some honesty. It seems to be a lot of it. But also,
what are you making the
also
point that women lie too much?
I don't think so.
Yes.
But it seems something about that was specifically more targeted in this instance.
I mean, it does seem like the story, like, I mean, it's, and everybody like points to this. And so one of the things that I was going to point out is that, like, I mean, I think you went to this, like, so like a while ago, we went to that one thing out in Grand Rapids, and like, Stephen Furtick preached on this passage, and he made a big deal about that Jesus calls the woman daughter, and that this is like the only time in scripture that Jesus ever calls someone daughter. And like, that's fine. Like, that's okay.
He said something else that I never heard someone say about this verse. I remember it was very different, and I was like, I don't disagree. I don't accept that or not accept that, but it was like, that was an interesting, I can't remember what it was.
Okay.
It was some, I thought maybe you were going to expand on that, but maybe that's
No, I mean, I don't fully remember his whole like,
Yeah,
sermon. I just remember that he was really harping on like the
Yeah.
point about like, it's a big deal that Jesus called her daughter. I'm like, okay, maybe like I'm not like against that, but to me, I actually think that kind of the point of him calling her daughter is actually to link her with the actual daughter. Like they told me, like it's supposed to be like a literary. I think it's supposed to be like a literary connection between the two of them to show like, oh, this is how they're linked. Like Jesus calls her daughter, like this person that like felt like she wasn't a daughter, but then like there's an actual daughter, and you have this dynamic that's going back and forth, and like the whole point of this dynamic is like I think is twofold, is in that it is like one, again, it's showing the power and like greatness of Jesus and showing how he's like redeeming them, but also showing that we're going to parallel these stories to showcase that the character of Jesus isn't limited by some of the things that you think it might be limited to. And so we'll hit that in a little bit.
I think maybe you're ready for a transition. So it's like, I don't know, but your new addition to your headcanon. if you
Sure,
will,
sure.
Kind of reminds me of what your take on the binding, which I think is
Yeah.
also makes sense just as much as this does. I think it's interesting how they, like you said, like this is kind of like an inversion, or use a different one maybe, of Eve, and like what's his face, is the lamb or whatever, and God will provide.
Yes.
And there's just like that kind of open thing, and it's just like a couple thousand years go by, and then here it is, and so like a couple thousand years go by, and here, and just like it makes more sense now that like the binding isn't just on its own, and now it's got this story that so like God does
Exactly.
not just once.
Yeah, exactly. It's a motif that shows up repeatedly. The call response thing and all of that, like it's a repeated motif. And so I mean, again, it's one of the things that's like you won't get that unless you read the Bible a whole lot.
Right.
And it's one of the things. It's definitely one of the things where I think criticisms of the Bible of like, oh, this is just like a weird thing that people put together and doesn't like really mean much or whatever is seriously lacking, because it's like, okay, they're clearly intentionally like, and this is one, it's like they're very clearly and intentionally referencing major things that happened in the past, and like they're very clearly and intentionally having similar story structures, and similar things happen over and over and over again, and like there's pretty much always a point to it. And so you have to come to the conclusion. I think his name's like Glenn Scrivener or whatever. He had this line where he was like, you either have to, and it happens a ton in all of the Gospels, not just like in Mark, it happens in all the Gospels. And he's like, you either have to come to the conclusion that like these four like random authors all made some of the most impactful works. Like they independently all made some of the most impactful works for the entirety of human history, all within a 100, like less than a 100-year time frame. Or you have to think that these things actually happened and like they wrote it out as best they could based off of like what they happened, and there's some kind of like divine inspiration thing going on here. Like you either have to think that like absolutely four geniuses made some of the most like incredible books ever written,
Who also found several ways to constantly make it tie, link, or
To-
share motifs with or
all the
carry
rest
on
of this
narratives
text,
or the rest of the Jewish text.
right? Or
Which in that case, brilliant job by these guys.
exactly. And it's like, well, it's incredible that like these four guys all did it, and did it in different ways where they're not just like copying each other. And so it's yeah, I'll leave that for there. So the only other thing, okay, so I don't have much to say about this, but I just wanted to point out the part about Peter, James, and John. So you could also think about that as being Peter and the Sons of Thunder, right? Because that's who James and John are. There are three different places in the Gospels that these guys are separated out. One is here. The other is at the Transfiguration. And then the other is at the Garden of Gethsemane, right? So those are the only like three times that happens. I don't know how to draw any bigger significance out of that than just stating that that's what it is.
They need to be referred to more as Peter and the Sons of Thunder.
It's a good band name.
It's a great band name, and every time it comes up, it needs to be in parentheses afterwards, saying Peter, James, and John, the Sons of Thunder. It needs to reference it, because I'll forget.
I also want to highlight the verse where it says, "The child is not dead but sleeping." This is very clearly so. This is actually another really good example of a part in Scripture that you are definitely not supposed to take literally. Like you are definitely not supposed to take this literally. And in fact, it's so obvious that you're not supposed to take it literally that whenever Jesus says another phrase like this in one of the other gospels, they're like, "Oh, really? They're just sleeping." And Jesus falls up. No, they're dead. and like I think it's the Lazarus story where he's like, "No, Lazarus is just sleeping," and they're like, "Oh, he's really just sleeping." He's like, "No, you idiots, he's dead." And
So you're saying Jesus is sarcasm?
kind of,
There's
but
he lied.
well, mm, the point, right? And this is where it's like, okay, don't read the Bible like an idiot. read it like someone that's actually trying to figure out what's going on. Like, what is Jesus trying to do? Jesus is trying, whenever he says that, Jesus is not just being like quirky and mysterious, right? He's trying to make a theological point. He's trying to make a point that he's trying to challenge their conceptions of death. He's trying to challenge them and get them to realize that death is not the end, right? That it's not just death. It's not just this happens and there's no more options and everything else is off the table. No, it's death is going to be functionally the same as sleep whenever I'm involved because, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? Whenever I'm involved, death is functionally just sleep, right? That's what he's trying to get them to realize, and that's what he's trying to get them to understand. Okay. Oh, I also want to highlight again, and that's at the very end, where he says, "Tell no one," but then he also says, "Give her something to eat." So that there's a subtle connection there between eating and being alive, which is a thing that actually it's another little kind of theme that pops up in other places in the Bible, especially other places in the Gospels. But there's this connection between eating and being alive. It's one of the reasons why people think that like there's all these stories that make sure to mention that when it doesn't really happen in Mark because Mark kind of gets ended abruptly. But in the other Gospels, there's all these stories of when Jesus comes back and he's eating things, right? So he eats fish with the people from the road to Emmaus. And then whenever he meets Peter, and he eats fish with Peter, right, on the beach, right? There's that whole scene. And part of what people think is going on there is that is meant to show that he is not just like a specter. He's not just a ghost. He is able to like bring food like into him. And so that's important. Okay. Similarities. Most of these we've already talked about, but I just kind of want to throw them all together. Both are women. It's obvious. Both involve 12 years in some way. Mike Winger talks about this a little bit in his video. I've seen some other people be like, is there a connection to the 12 tribes? I don't think there is. I think that 12 has more to do with being a reference to menstruation, right? That's what I think it is. It's like very clearly this woman's having an issue with menstruation for 12 years, and this girl should be at an age where that's like about to start, but like it didn't. And so both of them are kind of problems with menstruation or problems with this ability to bring in life, right? That they're both having that problem. Both are unclean. This is a point that not everybody makes. Everybody makes the point about the one with the issue of blood being unclean, but the little girl is dead. She's a dead body. Dead bodies are unclean. And what does Jesus do? He grabs her hand. So both are unclean, and both of them make contact with him, right? Jesus cared about both of them. Neither are named. Both are strictly referred to as daughter. Okay. Part of me, that's another one of those things that part of me thinks is actually part of the reason why I think they have that connection back to Eve. because in a sense, Eve is kind of unnamed too, right? Because Eve, in a sense, is almost more of like a title, right? It's woman, right? Is essentially what it is, right? Because Eve means mother, or mother, right? 'Cause it's mother of all the living. It's not really a name, right? And the same way, these two women kind of don't have names. They're just daughter, right? And so you actually like have that kind of ambiguous nature there of where you can tie them together. Okay. One had 12 years of life, then an abrupt death, followed by renewed life. The other had 12 years of, putting this in air quotes, death, right? Because she lived in this kind of dead state, both for herself and pain and everything, but also in her inability to bring about life, followed by renewed life. One is outside, surrounded by people that don't want her there. The other is inside, surrounded by people that want her to live. Right. So you have both of this issue of where they're at spatially, but also where the community's intention and focus is at on them. Are those things are different. One goes to Jesus, the other Jesus goes towards, right? And so that's important too. One had faith that Jesus would heal her. One couldn't possibly have had faith that Jesus could heal her because she was dead, right? Or she was just asleep, right? But this is what I was trying to get at whenever I'm saying the contrasts in the story are sort of the things that'll help us correct our bad theology about how we think about healing. Is one of the ways that everybody's like thinks about healing is like, you got to have enough faith. You got to have enough faith. Very clearly, there's a story where that's not possible because she's dead, right? But then you also have people, like, to kind of go back the other way, where you're more like a Calvinist persuasion, where they're like, you can't even approach God, right? Because that's what Calvinists say, right? Because they're like, you're so dead in your sins that you can't approach God. And yet, on the other side of this story, we have a story about a woman who has faith in Jesus and she approaches God, right? And so I like in this story, it's kind of both calling out this like name it, claim it theology, and also this like hard Calvinism determination that like, oh, you just can't do anything and you have no choice. There's no options for you. It's like, no, there's like God can use people in either situation and either thing. There's a spectrum of what you can and can't do, and Jesus cares about both of them, right? Actually, that was my last one. Yeah, was that everything? I think that was everything. I think that was everything that I wanted to say. Questions, comments?
So the only thing about what you said before is because you were at one point you were into the previous story, is that you were mentioning that you didn't want to elevate the woman to a for a similar reason.
I don't want to say that she is the second Eve.
Right. And I think the thing about that is that obviously the bigger and the more important thing about both of these stories is more that it's Jesus' involvement in the redemption of the earlier stories.
Correct.
And it's obvious, but obviously Jesus couldn't have taken the position as Eve for
he's going to have difficulty with that, right?
For a couple of reasons, but first of which is that he would have had to have done something wrong.
Debatable. But sure.
But
I don't think it has to be a perfect match to serve that thing, because you could make that same kind of claim
right.
with criticizing him, calling him the second Adam.
True.
Right.
But there's definitely an important part of that story being a repetition of Adam and Eve is Jesus' role, in that Jesus is here to redeem
Oh yeah.
all of the stories. So
Yes, exactly.
that was the important part for that. And I think there is something else. There's something to be said about that in the second story too. But I think what you hit on one. So one of the things obviously is we're gonna make the previous story ends with them saying your faith has made you well, but we're gonna cut to a story saying, okay, one, the people asking didn't have the best faith, and you didn't have any faith at the time, but this is gonna happen anyway.
Right.
And two, the idea of separating death from being a permanent end to more of a temporary state of being dormant.
Yeah, or it's a temporary inconvenience, right?
Yeah. Well, I think Jesus says sleeping, but I think but like you said, he scoffs at the idea of it being literally sleeping. I
Right.
do think something like temporarily dormant is
Yeah.
close. I think temporarily dormant is good because I think that also does refer, like you said, to the first woman. Because if she likely couldn't interact in society, couldn't bear children, she also is dormant to the society.
Right.
And in both of those instances, life is coming out of.
Yeah. And in that sense, you can almost see that they're living like, or for at least the last 12 years, they've kind of lived parallel lives, but at different stages of their lives, right? So like because one's old and one's young, but in like and like I'm not trying to like harp on it, but it does seem to be that it's related to childbirth, right? And so it's like they're not able, like neither one of them in that situation for those 12 years have been able to like have like children. And then something changes where then both of them now have the hope that in the future they could, right? And for both of them, and so and like you also have that like dichotomy of like one is an abrupt change, an abrupt thing that just happened that Jesus has then fixed, and the other one is an ongoing thing that's been happening for a long time that he also fixes. So like sometimes you have this thing of like, I've been dealing with this problem for so long, God's probably not going to fix it. But it's like, no, like he will. And whether that's so again, if like whether that's you have this problem because it's a normal natural state of how things progress, or whether it's an anomaly that's causing you issues, that's giving you problems, both of those things can be redeemed. Like nothing is like I really think that it's the kind of, it's supposed to be nothing, like it's showing the dichotomy of these two different things, of there being so many differences yet so many similarities between the story, to give a fullness picture of what Jesus is able to solve, of what Jesus is able to heal. That's why it's a story of ultimate healing. It's a healing that encompasses all of these different dynamics and facets.
The only, and for one other comparison to Eve for the second girl, is that she is literally life from sleeping, as it's put. Because Adam is put to sleep, and from that there comes Eve. She's sleeping, but she comes out of that. And that would probably be the other comparison that you could make to Eve directly, other than some of the minor ones, like not being named.
Right.
And then the looser ones of like secondhand to the more layered on
prominent,
motifs
like,
of the first story.
Yeah.
I remember the rough idea that, and this segues into my question, the rough idea that the guy said at that concert thing we went to.
Yeah.
Was he wasn't undermining the words of Jesus when he says your faith has made you well, but he said something as if to say it wasn't that this healed her. It was that she feared or something like that healed her. I can't remember. I wish I remember exactly what it was, but I remember it was like I was like, and so then, like how you said, we know that our faith does not just get us the healing. We know it's not the what was the phrase you used, the name it, call it, or whatever.
Yeah, name it, claim it.
Name it,
Like,
claim it,
yeah.
So we know that, and even Pastor preached on that a month or two ago.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he does say, Jesus says, your faith did this.
Yeah.
And so I'm not necessarily asking, like, all right, well, where's the cutoff? How do I know when I should have the faith to be healed and when should not? But is there much to make sense out of that? Like,
well,
wasn't a clear question in there, but maybe you see what I'm asking.
well, I think it's that. So, right, it's the faith that draws her in, and it's the fear that causes her to do the right thing and to respond
Right.
appropriately when he's there. And so I do think that, but also there's this idea that even like proper faith, right, is you have faith because of your understanding, right? Because like faith is not blind, right? Faith is based off of what you know about God's character, right? And so in this case, she actually is kind of questioning God's character. She actually doesn't know that much about God's character. It's actually all about his status. It's all about his status, which when status questions come up, typically in the Old Testament, the way that people respond to that status that God has is with fear, right? It's why they're always scared of him being there, which is why she has fear. And it's proper for her to have fear, right? And so, but that fear and that faith are like linked, right? Because the faith is spurred on by the acknowledgement of his status, right? And so they're linked together. And so, right, this is part of the issue that I have with the like name it, claim it stuff, is because it's like, yes, it is her faith that heals her, but whenever I say that, I'm saying, well, it's because it's the faith and the fear together that make her go closer to her. And so it's closer to God. So it's the act of going closer to God that heals her. It is not this, it's not this, I'm bringing God down to me and making him like subservient to me. It's not a vending machine thing where I have this much faith and I can pound my chest and do all of this stuff and be like, yes, God's going to do this. And so then he's obligated to listen to me. It's not that. It's I get closer to God in the right, proper way. And because of that, I get healed. And now, like, so in this story, it's actual, like, physical healing and everything. But the bigger meta story of all of that, which we've talked about, right, is that the physical healing isn't to the point, right? It's that getting closer to God will heal you, will set you free from demons, will do all of this stuff, will do all of these layered things that encompass all of that, because it brings you to the end, because it brings you to the kingdom of God, which at the start, the kingdom of God is at hand. And so now all of this stuff happens. And so it's like the healing happens, right? Because you are moving towards God, because you're moving towards the eschaton, which is where all of that healing stuff happens, right? But it can get experienced a little bit here and now. And so, this is kind of like one of my things is where it's like you're asking about that. Well, it sounds like you're asking about the question like, okay, do I just need enough faith to like be healed or to have this miracle happen?
And I know that I don't think I've ever really been a proponent of the name it, claim it.
Right.
Because we've all, even as kids, like you pray for something and you feel like you pray as hard as you can, you
Right.
pray as hard as you can, and it doesn't happen.
Right.
And at that point, you're like, all right. So there is some sort of like level to this that I'm just never gonna know, and I guess I'm okay with that. But
Right.
you know, and I am okay with that. Like it doesn't wreck my faith or anything. But just here it is, him saying your faith has healed you. So like, okay, there's more to it. There's like something in between. I know that, you know, when he heals the daughter, I mean, she's gonna die, you know, like you said. And so then it would, if you adopt that perspective, it's so much easier to at least accept that there isn't that perfect human answer that we want to get.
Yes.
So that will always satisfy me whenever I get this. Whenever, you know,
And this is
Wait.
my exact point of why they're together. My exact point for why they're together is to make the point of we can't say exactly like how, or to make the point that like that God isn't a mechanical like device. He's not a physical law in the world, right? He's not gravity, right? He's not we drop something and it falls, right? So it's not we meet this condition and then this happens. That's not how it works.
He's not a tame line.
Right, exactly. That's exactly the point. He's not a tame line, and so you don't just get to control him. And so the point is that when you come to understand that he doesn't, that you don't just get to control him, do you still trust him anyways? And do you still move closer to him? Do you still trust him anyways? And in order to do that, you have to trust his character. And when you do that, you're trusting his character. You're trusting that he's good. And so, and I think that's the thing that messes a lot of people up, especially whenever they then, what I find a lot whenever you get into like that headspace of name it, claim it stuff, is that people want to abuse God's goodness in
Just like we
order
talked
to get what
about-
they want.
Which is like what we talked about in the small group last week, how, you know, like, oh, if Hitler on his deathbed repented, but didn't in his last 20 years think, oh, well,
I mean, his
I,
death bunker.
my bad. I can do all this stuff knowing that as long as I repent right before I die,
Right.
I'll get away with it. You know, it's
Right.
the same idea.
And I think that there's a large, you can't trick God.
He knows your intent.
And it's also why, like, so for example, so last Wednesday, right, whenever I like share the story about like my testimony, like getting saved and everything, where I was like, I feel like for me, I have to be very careful about asking God for signs. And it's not because God doesn't do signs. I have to believe that God does signs because he did a sign for me, right? But it's more that I have to make sure that I get it in my head. I don't control God. I don't control what happens. I don't get to just go, oh, hey, please God, do this thing. And then, oh, look at that. He did it. Even though I did totally, as I was leaving church Sunday, I prayed as I got into my car. I was like, Lord, please let France score 2 goals so that I can watch the end of this game. And he totally answered that prayer. And I was like, let's go. And then I got there.
Kyle, you gave us the best World Cup.
This is what I'm saying. This is exactly my point.
God uses people.
Exactly. And I got there and I told them that, and they got mad at me for praying that. And they were like, how could you do that? Messi in Argentina have done so good. And I literally said, I was like, Messi can win now. I don't care. I just wanted to see the game. And then it proceeded to have the greatest overtime in the history of like soccer. And so after it was all over, I was like, you should be thanking me. I prayed to God and God answered and gave us
We
the
get to
greatest
do
game ever.
of pride that we probably shouldn't now.
I'm glad it was recorded.
Your moment in the sun.
No, but again, just my point is that like I actually think that it would be morally wrong. I think because if you just think about it with like any other relationship, at a certain point, it becomes morally wrong for you to constantly ask the other person to like prove
Right.
themselves to you, right? Like
Yeah.
if it like at this point in my stage of my life, if I went up to my parents and I was like, I really need you guys to just prove that you love me, like I'm a jerk. Like, I'm a
Let's get this
I'm
on
a
video.
I'm a really, really bad person if I do that. Because it's like, no, they've kind of proven that already, right? They've done enough. And it then gets put on me where I need to have the responsibility to just like recognize that and to act appropriately. And I think it's that way for like a lot of people. And so, I mean, so I'm kind of saying this to say that I sort of think that part of the reason why God answered like that prayer the way that he did whenever I was so young is because I was more immature. Like I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't really know how the world worked. I didn't know a lot of things. And so like I needed that at that point in time. But like once I had that, I had enough to like carry me basically through the rest of my life. It was like, okay, it doesn't really matter if everything else gets answered. And it's like, and I've had plenty of things in my life that like I pray for that don't get answered. And it's at those points where I then have to decide, oh, am I going to be mad at God because he didn't answer this, even though I know he does answer prayer and I have seen it. And so I have to have like the maturity to go, no, there's probably a reason for that. And I should just let it be and like go on. And I think that's like a level of maturity that I think a lot of the Christian church needs to come to whenever it comes to dealing with prayer and all of these things, and dealing with healing and all of these things, where it's like, okay, we should be petitioning God. We should be asking for these things. We should have faith that he is going to give them. But we should also have the faith to recognize that that's not everything. And that if it doesn't happen, it is not it is not like a mark against God's
I
character.
mean, that's why Jesus leaves some of the towns, because then it's like, well, these people get too caught up in the whole healing thing. Like,
Exactly.
That's not what it's about. That is a byproduct, and you will enjoy it as it comes. But yeah, good point.
All right. Gonna stop it there.